117 dead in Brazilian police operation against organized crime. The helicopters descended from the grey Rio de Janeiro sky like mechanical vultures, their rotors cutting through the humid morning air as they approached the sprawling favelas of Complexo do Alemão and Complexo da Penha. It was Tuesday, October 28, 2025. And what would become one of the largest police operations in Brazilian history was about to unfold. By the end of the day, 117 people would be dead, and the world would witness the brutal reality of what happens when organized crime is allowed to flourish unchecked in urban communities. But this wasn't just another police operation. This was a reckoning decades in the making, a violent confrontation between law enforcement and criminal organizations that had transformed entire neighborhoods into their personal kingdoms of terror. For years, the drug lords who controlled these areas had operated with virtual impunity, building empires built on the suffering of the very people they claimed to protect. The mainstream media would later paint this operation as excessive force, as police brutality against marginalized communities. They would focus on the death toll, the destroyed property, the fear in residents' eyes. But what they wouldn't tell you, what they systematically refused to acknowledge, is the daily horror that these communities had endured under criminal rule. They wouldn't speak of the children forced into drug trafficking, the young girls sexually abused by gang leaders, or the families terrorized into silence by threats of violence. This is the story that the media doesn't want you to hear. This is the reality of life under the iron fist of organized crime in Rio de Janeiro's favelas, and why sometimes extreme measures become the only option to restore basic human dignity to communities that have been forgotten by society and abandoned to the wolves. The criminals who died in this operation were not victims of police brutality. They were predators who had spent years preying on their own neighbors, turning children into soldiers and transforming entire communities into concentration camps where fear was the only law that mattered. The roots of organized crime's stranglehold on Rio de Janeiro's favelas stretch back decades, but the transformation of these communities into criminal strongholds accelerated dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s. What began as small-scale drug-dealing operations evolved into sophisticated criminal enterprises that would make the Italian mafia look like amateur hour. The Complexo do Alemão and Complexo da Penha became particular strongholds for these organizations, their maze-like streets and dense populations providing perfect cover for criminal activities. But more importantly, these areas offered something that criminal organizations prized above all else: a captive population that could be exploited, controlled, and terrorized into submission. The drug lords who rose to power in these communities understood a fundamental truth about human nature: that people will endure almost any abuse if they believe the alternative is death. They systematically destroyed any semblance of legitimate authority, driving out police, intimidating government officials, and creating their own parallel state where their word was law and dissent was punishable by execution. These weren't Robin Hood figures fighting against an oppressive system, despite how the media often portrays them. They were predators who recognized that the most vulnerable members of society, the poor, the uneducated, the desperate, could be easily manipulated and controlled if you combined just enough violence with just enough false promises of protection and prosperity. The recruitment of children became one of their most effective and most horrific strategies. Boys as young as 8 years old were given guns and taught to kill, not because the organizations needed child soldiers, but because children who grow up believing that violence is normal become adults who never question the system that created them. These criminal organizations weren't just running drug operations. They were systematically destroying the moral foundation of entire generations. Young girls faced an even worse fate. In communities where the criminal organizations held absolute power, sexual abuse became so normalized that many residents simply accepted it as an unavoidable part of life. Gang leaders would select girls from local families, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, and claim them as their property. Families who objected would face retaliation, not just against themselves, but against their entire extended family networks. The economic exploitation was equally systematic and devastating. Criminal organizations would impose their own taxation systems on local businesses, charging protection fees that often exceeded what legitimate businesses paid in actual taxes. Residents who tried to start legitimate enterprises found themselves forced to choose between paying tribute to criminals or having their businesses destroyed and their families threatened. But perhaps most insidiously, these organizations worked to create a culture of dependency that made resistance seem impossible. They would occasionally distribute food or medicine to residents, not out of generosity, but to create the illusion that the community needed them to survive. They would resolve disputes between neighbors, not to maintain peace, but to establish themselves as the ultimate arbiters of justice. They would protect residents from other criminals, conveniently ignoring the fact that they were the source of most of the danger in the first place. This systematic exploitation created a psychological prison that was often more effective than physical barriers. Residents learned to see their oppressors as protectors, their captors as providers, their tormentors as the only thing standing between them and complete chaos. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation that would have impressed totalitarian dictators throughout history. The transformation of children from innocent victims into willing participants in their own community's destruction represents perhaps the most evil aspect of how organized crime operates in Brazilian favelas. These criminal organizations didn't simply recruit children, they systematically destroyed their capacity for moral reasoning and turned them into weapons against their own families and neighbors. The process typically began when children were as young as 6 or 7 years old. Criminal organizations would identify families that were particularly vulnerable, single mothers, families with absent fathers, households struggling with extreme poverty, and begin a careful grooming process that could take years to complete. Initially, the approach would seem almost benevolent. Gang members would give children small gifts, candy, toys, sometimes even school supplies. They would offer to help families with basic necessities, paying for medicine when someone was sick, or providing food during particularly difficult periods. To desperate parents, these gestures seemed like acts of kindness from people who understood their struggles. But these gifts always came with small requests in return. A child might be asked to carry a message from one person to another, or to watch a particular street corner and report who came and went. The tasks seemed harmless, almost like games, and children were often excited to feel important and trusted by adults who treated them with respect. They would be given cell phones and taught to relay coded messages. They would be stationed at strategic locations to serve as lookouts during drug transactions or other criminal activities. By the time children realized they were participating in serious criminal activities, they were already so deeply involved that escape seemed impossible. They had been given money, status within their peer groups, and a sense of belonging that many had never experienced before. More importantly, they had been made complicit in crimes that could result in serious legal consequences if they were ever caught. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and devastating. Children were taught that the police were their enemies, that legitimate society had abandoned them, and that the criminal organization was the only family they could truly count on. They were shown examples of what happened to people who betrayed the organization, and they were made to understand that their own families would suffer if they ever tried to leave. The sexual abuse of children in these communities was equally systematic and even more horrific. Gang leaders would often maintain harems of young girls, some as young as 11 or 12 years old, who were treated as property to be used and discarded at will. These girls were often recruited through a combination of threats against their families and false promises of protection and prosperity. Parents who tried to protect their daughters faced impossible choices. They could attempt to resist and risk having their entire families murdered, or they could surrender their children and live with the knowledge that they had failed in their most basic duty as parents. Many families chose a third option. They fled their communities entirely, abandoning their homes and possessions to save their children from a fate worse than death. But even families who escaped often found that their trauma followed them. Children who had been abused or forced into criminal activities struggled to readjust to normal life. They had been taught that violence was the solution to every problem, that authority figures couldn't be trusted, and that their own worth was determined by their willingness to commit crimes. The long-term psychological damage to these children was incalculable. Many would never be able to form healthy relationships, hold legitimate jobs, or contribute positively to society. They had been robbed not just of their innocence, but of their capacity to envision a different kind of life for themselves and their own children. This cycle of abuse and exploitation created a self-perpetuating system that ensured criminal organizations would never lack for new recruits. Children who grew up in this environment often became adults who saw no alternative to the criminal lifestyle, and they would go on to recruit and abuse the next generation of victims. The economic stranglehold that criminal organizations maintained over favela communities was as sophisticated as any corporate monopoly, but infinitely more brutal in its enforcement mechanisms. These weren't simply drug dealers operating in poor neighborhoods. They were criminal enterprises that had created their own parallel economy based on fear, exploitation, and the systematic extraction of wealth from people who had almost nothing to begin with. The foundation of this economic control was what criminals euphemistically called taxation, but which was really nothing more than extortion on a massive scale. Every business operating within their territory, no matter how small or struggling, was required to pay regular tribute to the criminal organization. A small grocery store might be forced to pay the equivalent of several $100s per month, while larger businesses could face demands for thousands of dollars in protection money. These payments weren't optional, and the consequences for non-payment were swift and brutal. Business owners who tried to resist would first receive warnings. Perhaps their store windows would be broken, or their delivery trucks would be vandalized. If they continued to refuse payment, the escalation would be dramatic and public, designed to send a message to other potential resistors. The criminals understood that public examples were more effective than private punishments. A business owner who refused to pay might find his store burned to the ground in broad daylight, with dozens of witnesses forced to watch. In some cases, the business owner himself might be beaten or killed in front of his own family, ensuring that the lesson would be remembered by everyone in the community. But the economic exploitation went far beyond simple protection rackets. Criminal organizations would often force local businesses to purchase supplies exclusively from vendors controlled by the gang, even when those supplies were inferior or overpriced. They would demand that businesses hire specific individuals, usually gang members or their relatives, regardless of their qualifications or work ethic. The control extended to employment opportunities as well. Residents who wanted to work outside the favela often found that they needed permission from the criminal organization, and that permission usually came with conditions. Workers might be required to provide information about their employers, to smuggle contraband in their work bags, or to recruit new customers for the gang's drug operations. Even more insidiously, criminal organizations would sometimes prevent residents from seeking legitimate employment altogether. They understood that people with stable, legal income were less likely to participate in criminal activities, and they preferred to keep their communities economically dependent and desperate. The housing market within these communities was completely controlled by criminal organizations. Families couldn't move into or out of the area without permission, and that permission was often contingent on family members agreeing to work for the gang. Rent prices were artificially inflated, with much of the money going directly to criminal leaders rather than to legitimate property owners. Young men who tried to avoid involvement in criminal activities often found themselves facing impossible economic pressures. Legitimate jobs were scarce and usually paid very little, while criminal organizations offered immediate cash payments for relatively simple tasks. The choice between feeding your family and maintaining your moral integrity became a daily struggle for thousands of young people. The psychological impact of this economic control was devastating. Residents learned to see themselves as powerless victims of forces beyond their control, rather than as citizens with rights and opportunities. They developed a learned helplessness that made resistance seem futile and collaboration seem like the only rational choice. This economic stranglehold also served to isolate these communities from the broader Brazilian economy. Legitimate businesses were reluctant to invest in areas controlled by criminal organizations, and residents found it difficult to access banking services, credit, or other financial tools that might have helped them build better lives. The result was a parallel economy that enriched criminal leaders while keeping everyone else trapped in poverty and dependence. It was a system designed not just to generate profits from illegal activities, but to ensure that entire communities remained under criminal control for generations to come. One of the most disturbing aspects of how organized crime operates in Brazilian favelas is the systematic way that mainstream media outlets have worked to romanticize and legitimize criminal organizations while demonizing law enforcement efforts to combat them. This media manipulation has created a false narrative that portrays violent criminals as victims of social injustice and police officers as oppressors, inverting the moral reality of the situation in ways that would be comical if the consequences weren't so tragic. The media's portrayal of favela criminals as modern-day Robin Hood figures is not accidental. It's the result of a deliberate ideological campaign that seeks to undermine legitimate authority and promote a narrative of victimhood that excuses even the most heinous criminal behavior. Journalists and activists have created a mythology around these criminals that bears no resemblance to the reality experienced by the people who actually live under their control. This romanticization takes many forms, but it typically involves focusing on the poverty and social disadvantages that criminals experienced in their youth while completely ignoring the choices they made as adults to victimize their own communities. Media reports will spend paragraphs describing a gang leader's difficult childhood while barely mentioning the children he has recruited into drug trafficking or the women he has sexually assaulted. The language used to describe criminal organizations is particularly revealing. Media outlets routinely refer to them as community leaders or local authorities, as if they were elected officials rather than violent predators who maintain power through intimidation and murder. They describe criminal-controlled territories as autonomous zones or self-governing communities, ignoring the fact that residents have no choice in how they are governed and no recourse when they are abused. When law enforcement operations result in criminal casualties, the media response is immediate and predictable. There are calls for investigations into police conduct, demands for accountability, and extensive coverage of grieving family members. But when criminals murder innocent residents, rape children, or terrorize entire communities, these same media outlets are often silent or dismissive. This double standard extends to how victims are portrayed. When criminals are killed by police, they are described as young men or community members whose lives were cut short by violence. But when innocent residents are killed by criminals, they are often portrayed as being somehow complicit in their own deaths. Perhaps they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or they failed to follow the unwritten rules that govern life in criminal-controlled territories. The media's treatment of police officers is equally biased and destructive. Officers who risk their lives to protect communities from criminal violence are routinely portrayed as trigger-happy racists who enjoy killing poor people. Their motivations are questioned, their methods are criticized, and their successes are minimized or ignored entirely. This media bias has real-world consequences that extend far beyond public opinion. It makes it more difficult for law enforcement agencies to recruit qualified officers, reduces public support for anti-crime initiatives, and creates political pressure to limit police operations, even when they are desperately needed to protect innocent people. Perhaps most perniciously, this media narrative helps criminal organizations maintain control over their territories by reinforcing the idea that residents have no alternative to criminal rule. When the media portrays police as enemies and criminals as protectors, it becomes much easier for criminal organizations to convince residents that cooperation with law enforcement will only make their situations worse. The international media has been particularly guilty of promoting this false narrative, often relying on local activists and journalists who have their own ideological agendas, rather than seeking out the voices of ordinary residents who have suffered under criminal rule. Foreign correspondents parachute into these communities for brief visits, interview carefully selected sources, and then file reports that confirm their pre-existing biases about police brutality and social injustice. This international attention has made the problem worse by creating incentives for local media outlets to adopt even more extreme anti-police positions in order to gain attention and credibility with foreign audiences. The result is a media ecosystem that is completely disconnected from the reality experienced by the people it claims to represent. The October 28, 2025 police operation that resulted in 117 deaths was not an isolated incident of police brutality, as the media would have you believe. It was the culmination of years of careful planning and intelligence gathering, designed to dismantle criminal organizations that had turned entire communities into their personal fiefdoms. The operation was necessary, justified, and long overdue. The planning for this operation began months earlier, as law enforcement agencies gathered intelligence about the structure and activities of criminal organizations operating in the Complexo do Alemão and Complexo da Penha. They identified key leaders, mapped out criminal networks, and documented the systematic abuse that residents had endured for years. The decision to launch such a large-scale operation was not made lightly. Law enforcement officials understood that it would result in significant casualties and would generate intense media criticism. But they also understood that smaller, more limited operations had failed to break the criminal organization's stranglehold on these communities, and that more aggressive action was necessary to protect innocent residents. The operation itself was conducted with precision and professionalism that contradicts the media narrative of indiscriminate police violence. Officers targeted specific individuals who had been identified as key figures in criminal organizations, and they used intelligence gathered over months of investigation to minimize risks to innocent civilians. The 117 people who died in this operation were not innocent victims of police brutality. They were armed criminals who chose to resist arrest and engage in firefights with law enforcement officers. Many of them were wanted for serious crimes, including murder, rape, kidnapping, and drug trafficking. Their deaths removed some of the most dangerous predators from communities that had suffered under their rule for years. The immediate aftermath of the operation saw a dramatic reduction in criminal activity in both complexes. Drug trafficking operations were disrupted, Extortion schemes were dismantled, and residents began to experience a level of safety and freedom that many had not known for years. Children could play in the streets without fear of being recruited by criminal organizations. Women could move around their communities without fear of sexual assault, and businesses could operate without paying tribute to criminal leaders. But the media coverage focused almost exclusively on the death toll and the destruction caused by the operation, while ignoring the positive impact it had on the lives of ordinary residents. Journalists interviewed criminal sympathizers and activists who condemned the police action, but they made little effort to speak with residents who were grateful to be free from criminal oppression. The international reaction was equally predictable and equally divorced from reality. Human rights organizations that had remained silent about years of criminal abuse suddenly discovered their voices when criminals were killed by police. Foreign governments that had ignored the systematic victimization of favela residents expressed concern about police tactics and called for investigations. This reaction revealed the fundamental moral confusion that characterizes much of the international discussion about crime and law enforcement in Brazil. The same people who claim to care about human rights and social justice are more concerned about the welfare of violent criminals than about the innocent people those criminals have victimized. The operation also exposed the hypocrisy of political leaders who had spent years making speeches about the need to combat organized crime while simultaneously criticizing every effective law enforcement action. These politicians understood that taking strong action against criminal organizations was necessary, but they lacked the courage to publicly support the police officers who were willing to risk their lives to protect innocent people. The success of this operation demonstrates that criminal organizations are not invincible, and that determined law enforcement action can break their control over communities. But it also shows that such operations require political will and public support that is often lacking in Brazil's current political climate. The aftermath of the October 28th operation revealed both the potential for positive change and the obstacles that prevent lasting solutions to the problem of organized crime in Brazilian favelas. In the immediate weeks following the operation, residents of both complexes experienced a level of freedom and safety that many had not known for years, but the long-term success of the intervention would depend on factors that extended far beyond law enforcement. The most immediate change was the dramatic reduction in visible criminal activity. Drug trafficking operations that had operated openly for years were suddenly forced underground or abandoned entirely. The armed checkpoints that had controlled movement within the communities disappeared overnight. Children who had been recruited as lookouts and messengers were suddenly free to attend school and play like normal kids. Residents began to emerge from their homes and interact with their neighbors in ways that had been impossible under criminal rule. Women could walk through their communities without fear of harassment or assault. Business owners could operate without paying tribute to criminal organizations. Families could make decisions about their lives without seeking permission from gang leaders. But the operation also revealed the depth of the damage that years of criminal control had inflicted on these communities. Many residents struggled to adjust to their newfound freedom, having become so accustomed to living under authoritarian rule that they didn't know how to function in a more open society. Children who had been recruited into criminal activities faced particular challenges. Many had never attended school regularly and lacked basic literacy and numeracy skills. Others had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into criminal culture that they saw legitimate authority figures as enemies and violence as the normal way to resolve conflicts. The economic impact of dismantling criminal organizations was also complex. While residents were no longer forced to pay tribute to criminal leaders, many had also lost their primary sources of income when drug trafficking operations were shut down. The challenge was to create legitimate economic opportunities that could replace the criminal economy that had sustained these communities for so long. The media response to these positive changes was predictably muted. Journalists who had spent weeks criticizing the police operation showed little interest in documenting the improvements in residents' lives. Stories about children returning to school or businesses reopening without fear of extortion didn't fit the narrative of police brutality and community victimization that dominated coverage of the operation. This media bias had real consequences for the long-term success of the intervention. Public support for continued law enforcement presence in these communities was undermined by constant criticism of police tactics. Political leaders who might have supported expanded social programs and economic development initiatives were reluctant to be associated with an operation that had been portrayed as excessive and brutal. The international reaction was equally counterproductive. Human rights organizations that could have helped document the positive changes in these communities instead focused their efforts on investigating alleged police misconduct. Foreign governments that could have provided support for reconstruction and development programs instead called for investigations and accountability measures that diverted resources away from helping residents rebuild their lives. Perhaps most frustratingly, the success of the operation was used by critics as evidence that less violent methods could have achieved the same results. They argued that if criminal organizations could be dismantled so quickly, it proved that the police had been exaggerating the threat they posed. This logic ignored the years of failed attempts to address the problem through community policing, social programs, and negotiation with criminal leaders. The reality is that criminal organizations only respect force, and they only abandon their control over communities when they are convinced that the costs of resistance exceed the benefits of continued criminal activity. The October 28 operation succeeded precisely because it demonstrated that law enforcement agencies were willing and able to use overwhelming force against criminal organizations that refused to surrender peacefully. The October 28, 2025 police operation in Rio de Janeiro's Complexo do Alemão and Complexo da Penha represents a watershed moment in Brazil's ongoing struggle against organized crime. The death of 117 criminals in a single day sent a clear message that the Brazilian state was finally willing to use decisive force to protect its citizens from predators who had terrorized entire communities for decades. This operation was not an act of police brutality, as the media would have you believe. It was an act of liberation. The violent but necessary removal of criminal organizations that had turned thousands of innocent people into prisoners in their own homes. The men who died in this operation were not victims of social injustice. They were perpetrators of systematic abuse who had chosen to build their wealth and power on the suffering of their neighbors. The media's portrayal of this operation as excessive force reveals a fundamental moral confusion that has plagued discussions of crime and law enforcement in Brazil for years. The same journalists and activists who claim to care about human rights and social justice have consistently prioritized the welfare of violent criminals over the safety and dignity of their victims. This inversion of moral values has real consequences that extend far beyond media coverage. It undermines public support for effective law enforcement, creates political pressure to limit police operations, and helps criminal organizations maintain their stranglehold on vulnerable communities by convincing residents that cooperation with law enforcement will only make their situations worse. The residents of Complexo do Alemão and Complexo da Penha, who experienced liberation on October 28th, understand what the media refuses to acknowledge, that sometimes violence is necessary to stop greater violence, and that the temporary disruption caused by police operations is a small price to pay for freedom, from criminal oppression. The children who can now attend school without fear of recruitment into drug trafficking, the women who can walk through their communities without fear of sexual assault, and the families who can make decisions about their lives without seeking permission from gang leaders are the real beneficiaries of this operation. Their voices have been largely ignored by media outlets that prefer to focus on the grievances of criminal sympathizers and the criticism of international human rights organizations. The success of this operation demonstrates that criminal organizations are not invincible, and that determined law enforcement action can break their control over communities. But it also shows that such operations require political will and public support that is often lacking in Brazil's current political climate. The challenge now is to build on this success by creating legitimate institutions and economic opportunities that can prevent criminal organizations from regaining control. This will require sustained commitment from government officials, significant investment in education and economic development, and a willingness to ignore the criticism of those who would prefer to see these communities remain under criminal control. Most importantly, it will require Brazilian society to reject the false narrative that portrays violent criminals as victims and law enforcement officers as oppressors. The reality is exactly the opposite. The police officers who participated in this operation were heroes who risked their lives to protect innocent people, while the criminals who died were predators who had spent years victimizing their own communities. The 117 deaths on October 28th were not a tragedy. They were a victory for justice and human dignity. Every criminal who died in this operation was someone who could no longer recruit children into drug trafficking, sexually assault young girls, or terrorize families into submission. Their deaths made these communities safer, freer, and more hopeful than they had been in years. The media's refusal to acknowledge this reality reveals their own moral bankruptcy and their willingness to sacrifice the welfare of innocent people on the altar of ideological purity. They would rather see children continue to be abused and families continue to live in fear than admit that sometimes the only way to stop evil is to use force against those who perpetrate it. The international community's criticism of this operation is equally misguided and hypocritical. The same governments and organizations that express concern about police tactics in Brazil remain silent about the systematic abuse that criminal organizations inflict on favela residents. They care more about the rights of violent criminals than about the rights of innocent people to live free from fear and oppression. This operation should serve as a model for how to deal with organized crime in urban environments around the world. It demonstrates that criminal organizations only respect force, and that they will only abandon their control over communities when they are convinced that the costs of resistance exceed the benefits of continued criminal activity. The October 28th operation was a reminder that the state has a fundamental responsibility to protect its citizens from those who would harm them, and that this responsibility sometimes requires the use of force against those who refuse to respect the law. The 117 criminals who died chose their fate when they decided to build their lives on the suffering of others. Their deaths were not senseless violence. They were the inevitable consequence of a life spent victimizing innocent people. The only tragedy is that it took so long for the Brazilian state to take decisive action against these predators, and that so many innocent people had to suffer under their rule before justice was finally served. If this story opened your eyes to the reality of organized crime in Brazil, share it with others who need to understand the truth behind the media's false narratives. The fight for justice and human dignity continues, and it requires all of us to stand with those who are willing to confront evil wherever it exists.